What happened to the waste of a society that lived centuries before any sewage system, before pipes, before any modern notion of sanitation? How did a people who sailed oceans and forged iron capable of withstanding the test of time deal with something as basic and as inevitable as their own waste? For a long time, it was imagined that the Vikings simply lived in perpetual filth. The popular image portrays them as mud-covered warriors, living among organic remains scattered around their wooden and turf homes. But this view says more about modern prejudices than about archaeological evidence. Excavations in settlements in Scandinavia, the British Isles, and even Greenland reveal a much more complex and surprisingly organized picture. In places like ancient coastal villages in present-day Denmark and Norway, layers of soil show specific disposal patterns. Waste wasn't simply left haphazardly, it was moved, concentrated, separated. In many settlements, archaeologists have identified peripheral areas where bone remains, ashes, and household debris were systematically accumulated. It wasn't disorder, it was management. Without plumbing, the system relied on something older than any technology, an understanding of the environment. Viking houses were built with attention to the direction of prevailing winds. The positioning of latrines, often small structures away from the main dwelling, followed a similar logic. Not by chance, soil analyses reveal concentrations of organic matter in points strategically located away from food preparation areas and water sources. But the story goes beyond simple physical separation. Organic waste was often reused. Food scraps and animal manure were incorporated into the soil, enriching the land in small agricultural areas near the settlements. The line between disposal and fertilization was thin. What we call waste today was, for them, part of a cycle. Ashes from fireplaces, always lit, always central, served multiple functions. They helped absorb odors in latrines. They were spread over damp areas to reduce insect proliferation. Mixed with soil, they helped modify its composition. In excavations, alternating layers of ash and organic matter indicate a deliberate covering practice, almost a proto-composting system. And then there are the quieter traces. Plant seeds found in old cesspools. Some of them were not part of the common diet. They were herbs with aromatic and repellent properties. This suggests that, in addition to simply keeping waste away, there was concern about smell, health, and the quality of the inhabited space. Viking settlements were living organisms. Turf houses provided insulation from the cold, but also required controlled ventilation. Animals shared close proximity with humans during the harsh winter, which increased waste production. Still, evidence indicates that there were clear cleaning routines. Household waste did not remain indefinitely inside the structures. It was removed. In some denser urban areas, such as shopping centers established in coastal regions, signs of excavated ditches for rainwater and liquid waste drainage are emerging. These were not closed systems like those developed by the Romans centuries earlier, but they demonstrate practical adaptation to local conditions. Rainwater, abundant in northern Europe, was used as a natural ally to carry debris to lower and more distant areas. The odor, inevitably present, was part of the sensory experience of the period. Damp wood, constant smoke, tanned leather, dried fish, wet earth. However, the absence of plumbing did not mean sanitary neglect. It meant dependence on the landscape. The tide carried away what was disposed of at suitable points along the coast. The extreme cold slowed decomposition. The soil absorbed and transformed it. Waste management was not an isolated system. It was integrated into the architecture, the climate, and the rhythm of the seasons. In the summer, with the thaw and increased agricultural activity, disposal areas were reorganized. In the winter, When the ground froze, the strategy changed. Waste was temporarily accumulated, awaiting spring for redistribution. This fragile balance reveals something essential. Survival in the North depended not only on strength or courage. It depended on a deep understanding of the environment. Every decision, where to dig, where to discard, where to build, was shaped by an intimate relationship with nature. When we look at the layers of earth excavated by modern archaeologists, we don't just see remains, we see patterns, we see choices repeated generation after generation, and we begin to realize that, even without underground pipes or complex urban systems, there was a different kind of engineering there, invisible, organic, adaptive. What we call trash was, for them, part of a larger cycle. Nothing stayed still for long. Everything returned to the soil, the sea, the wind. And perhaps, in this constant flow between disposal and renewal, lies one of the most silent lessons left by these people from the North. If waste disposal was part of a cycle, then latrines were merely the visible surface of a much deeper system. Excavations in ancient settlements in the region of present-day Denmark and Norway reveal pits dug with relative standardization. Sufficient depth to isolate the waste, a calculated distance from water sources, and often layers of earth and ash covering. It wasn't improvisation. It was learned repetition. The idea that pre-modern societies were unaware of the risks of contamination is a comfortable myth. They may not have understood bacteria, but they understood the consequences. Contaminated water made people sick. Strong odors attracted unwanted animals. Insects proliferated where there was accumulation. Constant observation of the environment was the science available to them. In some denser urban areas, such as commercial centers that flourished along the North Sea, archaeologists have identified organic waste concentrated in specific zones, away from workshops and market areas. This indicates something beyond simple household disposal. There was collective organization. Communities coordinated spaces for common use. The very structure of the longhouses influenced this system. The so-called Viking longhouse sheltered families and, often, animals under the same roof during the colder months. This meant an inevitable accumulation of dung and organic waste. However, evidence shows that the floor was periodically renewed. Layers of plant material were replaced. The old material was removed and taken outside, becoming part of the disposal areas. This constant removal transformed waste into a resource. Animal manure enriched fields. Fish remains, abundant in coastal communities, were incorporated into the soil as fertilizer. Bone fragments were reused in the production of tools. The modern concept of useless waste practically did not exist. There are also microscopic traces found in ancient sediments, parasite eggs, pollen, fragments of plant fibers. They reveal not only dietary habits, but also sanitary practices. The reduced presence of certain parasites in specific settlements suggests that waste management was, in many cases, efficient enough to limit widespread infections. The climate also played a crucial role. Long winters and sub-zero temperatures slowed decomposition and reduced the proliferation of pathogens. The cold was a silent ally. However, the spring thaw brought new challenges. Areas that had remained frozen for months needed to be reorganized. Pits were reopened. Land was drained. In regions like Iceland, where volcanic soils offered unique conditions, the interaction between natural ash and organic waste created an environment conducive to the rapid transformation of discarded material. The geology itself shaped the informal sanitation system. The sea, ever present in Viking life, also played a part in this process. In coastal settlements, analyses indicate that some of the waste was disposed of in specific areas of the tidal line, not indiscriminately, but in points where currents and variations in water level transported the material away from the inhabited area. It was a practical understanding of local hydrodynamics. Still, we shouldn't completely romanticize it. The smell was part of everyday life. Smoke from fireplaces mingled with the smell of dried fish and leather. Damp earth absorbed liquids that couldn't be fully controlled. But what's surprising is the absence of evidence of chronic sanitary collapse in many of these places. There are no signs of mass abandonment due to ongoing unsanitary conditions. Waste disposal, therefore, was not a secondary detail. It was a component of survival in the North. Just as shipbuilding required precision, waste management demanded daily discipline. There was no glamour in it, just necessity. Looking at the layers excavated centuries later, we see traces of repeated decisions. Ditches dug again in the same location. Layers of ash applied regularly. Urban spaces that evolved without losing the logic of separating drinking water and waste. Perhaps the most revealing aspect is this: the absence of plumbing did not mean the absence of a system. It meant a different system, based on natural cycles, constant observation, and seasonal adaptation. An invisible model, shaped not by stone or metal pipes, but by a deep understanding of how the environment responds to human actions. And, by following these clues buried beneath meters of soil, we begin to realize that true engineering wasn't just in the ships that crossed oceans. It was also in how an entire society learned to live with what everyone produces, and few want to confront. But there is an even more revealing detail buried in these layers of dark earth. The waste was not merely discarded. It recorded life. Each ancient cesspool now functions as a biological archive. There lie seeds that escaped chewing, fragments of grains, fish bones, fabric fibers, remnants of medicinal herbs. What was waste to them has become testimony for archaeology. Excavations carried out in ancient commercial centers of Scandinavia have identified latrines that remained in use for years, sometimes decades, before being sealed and replaced. The closure was not abrupt. Layers of earth were deliberately applied, isolating the previous contents before a new pit was opened next to it. There is method in this pattern. There is planning. This behavior reveals something fundamental: the notion of limits. The disposal area had a life cycle. When it reached a certain point, it was closed, and another was created. This requires community coordination. It requires collective memory. It requires someone to monitor, observe, and decide. The landscape surrounding the settlements was also shaped by this practice. Small artificial mounds identified at archaeological sites are not natural. They are gradual accumulations of organic waste mixed with soil, compacted over the years. Over time, they become part of the terrain. The waste ceases to be visible. It merges with the topography. And then there's the sensory dimension of this world. Imagine walking through a coastal settlement in the middle of summer. The wind from the sea carries salt and humidity. The smoke from the fireplaces carries the scent of resinous wood. Near the outskirts, the smell changes, denser, more earthy. But it's not a suffocating chaos. It's part of the environment, integrated into the routine. In winter, the scene transforms. The soil hardens like stone. Immediate disposal becomes difficult. Temporary piles appear, awaiting the thaw. When spring arrives, the process begins again. Redistribution, covering, reintegration into the soil. Time dictates the pace of cleanliness. Interestingly, this adaptation wasn't merely practical, it was cultural. The organization of the space reflected implicit values about order and coexistence. Excessive proximity between waste and drinking water was avoided. Common areas maintained a certain separation. The settlement functioned like an organism that needed to maintain internal balance. Compared to the monumental drainage systems built by other civilizations, the Viking model seems simple. There were no grand aqueducts. There were no underground galleries lined with stone. But there was something equally sophisticated: an invisible engineering based on continuous environmental observation. The soil of northern Europe, rich in organic matter and often damp, required attention. Excessive saturation could transform areas into contamination hotspots. Therefore, the choice of land for settlement already considered natural drainage. Gentle elevations were preferred. Proximity to water was essential, but not too immediate. This balance reveals a mindset different from ours. Today, we hide waste under concrete and pipes. It disappears from sight. In that world, nothing disappeared completely. Waste was seen, handled, covered, transformed. The relationship was direct, almost intimate. Perhaps that's why the notion of collective responsibility was more concrete. When the system depends on constant human effort, digging, transporting, covering, each individual participates in the process. Hygiene is not delegated to an invisible infrastructure. It is lived experience. Upon examining this system as a whole, we realize that it was neither improvised nor rudimentary. It was adaptive, flexible, shaped by the seasons, the climate, the soil type, and the population density. It was engineering without monuments. And the more we dig into these layers, the more evident it becomes that the absence of plumbing didn't represent absolute backwardness. It represented a different logic, a circular logic, where waste returned to the environment and was reintegrated into the production chain. In the silence of modern excavations, amidst shovels and brushes, a disconcerting realization emerges. Waste management reveals the true level of organization of a society. And in the case of the Vikings, far from the caricature of perpetual filth, we find a resilient system, imperfect, yes, but deeply connected to the territory they inhabited. Beneath the dark earth of the North, what was discarded centuries ago continues to tell a story. Not of neglect, but of adaptation. Not of chaos, but of a delicate balance between survival and the environment. And in the end, the story of the garbage reveals something bigger than hygiene. It reveals mentality. Beneath every excavated Scandinavian settlement lies a dark layer of soil that archaeologists call cultural. It's not ordinary soil. It's soil transformed by human presence. A mixture of ash, bones, organic matter, wood fragments, food scraps, and animal dung. This layer is the physical record of generations who learned slowly not to fight against the environment, but to operate within it. The absence of plumbing didn't mean negligence, it meant direct responsibility. Each dug pit required effort. Each layer of cover required work. Each seasonal reorganization demanded collective memory. There was no invisible infrastructure hiding the problem beneath the urban soil. Disposal was part of the visible routine of survival. And perhaps that is precisely what disconcerts us most today. Accustomed to pressing a button and making disappear what we don't want to see, we forget that every system depends on balance. Vikings couldn't afford to ignore consequences. Contaminated water meant disease. Saturated soil meant famine. Poorly organized space meant risk. Therefore, their settlements were conceived as organisms. Houses positioned according to the wind. Disposal areas away from water sources. Ashes reused for absorption and mulch. Manure reintegrated into the field. Waste was not a flaw in the system. It was part of it. This circular logic was reinforced by the northern environment itself. Long winters slowed decomposition. Short summers demanded maximum agricultural productivity. Nothing could be wasted. What came out of the human or animal body needed to return to the soil in a controlled manner. Over the centuries, this practice created transformed landscapes. small artificial hills, enriched soils, cultivated areas nourished by what was once rejected. The boundary between dirt and fertility was a matter of management, not repulsion. And here, an inevitable reflection arises. Civilizations are not defined solely by spectacular achievements, but by invisible systems that prevent collapse. Waste management is one of these silent systems. When it fails, everything fails. When it works, nobody notices. The Vikings sailed open oceans, explored distant territories, and built ships capable of crossing hostile seas. But before any expedition, there was a daily reality to be maintained. There were animals to feed, land to preserve, water to protect. There was a balance to be upheld. The true engineering of that world wasn't just in the keels that cut across the North Atlantic. It was in the repeated discipline of digging, covering, moving, transforming. Knowledge transmitted not through written treatises, but through constant practice. Beneath the dark earth of Scandinavia, what has been discarded continues to teach. It teaches that sustainability is not a modern concept. It teaches that adaptation precedes sophisticated technology. It teaches that effective systems can exist without monumentality. Perhaps what is most striking is not the absence of piped sewage, but the absence of widespread sanitation collapse in such hostile environments. This is only possible when a society deeply understands the limits of its territory. And then the final question remains. Surrounded by invisible infrastructure and automated systems, do we still understand the cycles that sustain our own survival? If you value exploring these hidden layers of history, where engineering, nature, and human behavior intertwine, subscribe to the channel. Because beneath the soil of the past, there are still forgotten systems waiting to be revealed.